A fractured morning. It was the little things that seemed to set off the storm. Claire had asked David to pick up the dry cleaning on his way home from work. Simple, right? But when David came through the door, hands empty, her frustration erupted like an untamed fire. The dry cleaning was just a small piece of their mounting distance, but to Claire, it was a symbol of something deeper, a lack of care, of listening, of being present. David, I asked you to do one thing, Claire said, her voice tight, her eyes narrowed. One thing, and you couldn't even do that. David, taken aback by the intensity of her words, felt a familiar lump in his throat. His first instinct was to defend himself, but the silence between them was heavy, suffocating. He hadn't even realized how much it meant to her. I'm sorry, Claire, he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. I just forgot. It was a crazy day at work. Claire turned away, her back stiff, and David could see the hurt in the way she held herself. His chest tightened with the weight of regret. He wasn't just sorry for forgetting, he was sorry for not noticing how tired she had been, how she had been carrying the emotional load of their home alone for weeks now. He wanted to say more, to reach her, but the words felt like they were trapped in his throat, suffocated by a mounting wall of unspoken emotions. Claire, on the other hand, was drowning in her own thoughts. She wasn't angry about the dry cleaning, not really. She was angry about everything that had been left unsaid. She felt invisible in her marriage. The constant give and take felt so one-sided. David worked hard, she knew that, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was more invested in his job than in her. Her thoughts spiraled as she stood at the kitchen counter, fiddling with the edge of the knife she had been using to chop vegetables earlier. Her silence was a form of defense, a way to shield herself from the hurt she couldn't express. David stepped forward, gently touching her arm. Can we talk about this? He asked, his voice soft but with an undercurrent of desperation. But before Claire could answer, the doorbell rang. A disruptive visitor. It was Claire's mother, Margaret, standing on the other side of the door with a warm smile. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in an otherwise suffocating room. Hello, darling, Margaret greeted, stepping inside with her usual lively energy. She barely noticed the tension between the couple as she wrapped Claire in a hug. I thought I'd pop by for a little visit. I brought you some homemade soup. Margaret's cheerful demeanor temporarily broke the cold atmosphere. David exhaled, relieved for the distraction, while Claire, still stewing in her emotions, forced a smile. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mother was going to be another person who would try to solve everything with simple, well-intentioned advice. I'm sorry we haven't had the chance to catch up, Mom, Claire muttered, but the words lacked their usual warmth. Margaret looked from Claire to David, sensing the silent tension. Her instincts, honed over years of being a mother, told her that there was something more beneath the surface. Is everything okay between you two? She asked, her voice gently probing. David glanced at Claire, who shrugged, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. He didn't want to drag her mother into their fight, but the pressure was building, and he felt himself unraveling. Margaret sat down at the table, looking between the two of them. You know, David, Claire doesn't ask for much, she began, her tone unexpectedly stern. She's been carrying a lot for a while now. And sometimes, a little gesture, even something small, can mean the world to her. David winced, feeling the sting of the truth in Margaret's words. He wasn't a bad person. He loved Claire, but the small things had somehow slipped through his fingers. Claire stared at her mother, unsure of how to respond. The words caught in her throat, but she felt a tear slip down her cheek, something she hadn't allowed herself to do in front of anyone, especially David. I just feel like you don't see me anymore, Claire finally whispered, her voice trembling. Like I'm not even here. David's heart shattered as he watched Claire's vulnerability. His mind raced with regret and guilt. He had been blind to her pain, wrapped up in his own world. But now, in this quiet moment, he saw it clearly. Margaret, sensing the rawness of the moment, stood up and gently placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. Sometimes, Love requires more than just good intentions, David. It requires action. And patience. A reckoning. David took a deep breath, his body heavy with the weight of Margaret's words. He had been so focused on being the provider, the dependable partner, that he had forgotten how to be emotionally present. He had forgotten what it meant to truly listen, to understand the deeper, unsaid things that Claire was carrying. Claire, David said, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. I've failed you. I've been so caught up in work that I haven't been here, really here, with you. Claire looked at him, her eyes still wet with tears, but there was something softer in them now, something that resembled hope. David walked over to her, kneeling down in front of her. I can't promise I'll always get it right, but I want to try. I want to be the partner you need, not just the husband you're left with when the day is done. The sincerity in his voice cut through the air, and for the first time in a long while, Claire felt seen. Thank you, Claire whispered, her voice raw but full of gratitude. I need you to be present with me. Not just physically, but emotionally. Margaret stood at the door, watching the exchange with a quiet smile. She had seen the cracks, but she knew her daughter and son-in-law. There was love there, tender, raw, and real. David stood, holding out his hand to Claire. Come on, he said softly. Let's fix this together. One step at a time. A new beginning. Over the next few days, things between David and Claire didn't immediately return to normal. But there was a shift. A quiet understanding that had been absent before began to bloom. David took her hand more often, whispered his thoughts to her, and listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart. And Claire, though hesitant at first, began to open up again, sharing the worries and dreams she had buried for far too long. Margaret, though a small part of the resolution, had unknowingly pushed them toward the necessary conversation. Her visit, however unwelcome it had felt at first, had planted a seed that would grow into something stronger. It wasn't perfect. Their relationship wasn't perfect. But they were learning, together. And in the quiet moments that followed, when they lay side by side in bed, they both realized that sometimes, love wasn't just about grand gestures, it was about being present when it mattered the most. And that was a start.